This is one of the most staggering military transformations in history. It's a story about a nation with an army so small it could barely defend a single one of its own cities. Yet in just 5 years, that nation built a military of nearly 1 million people. And this new force would go on to do something that no one thought was possible. They would face the seemingly unbeatable Imperial Japanese Army and hand them their first major land defeat of the entire war. This is the story of how Australia, a country facing the threat of total invasion, reinvented itself into a military powerhouse that consistently punched far above its weight. To truly understand the scale of this transformation, you have to picture Australia in the 1930s. War was brewing and exploding across Europe, but for most Australians, it felt a world away. They were an island continent protected by the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean on one side and the Indian on the other. More importantly, they were protected by the might of the British Empire and its Singapore strategy. The idea that a powerful Royal Navy based in a fortress at Singapore would shield Australia from any threat. This sense of security led to a dangerous complacency. The country's permanent, full-time army was less than 4,000 men. That's it. The main defensive force was the militia, a group of 80,000 part-time volunteers, but they were often dismissed by professionals as more of a weekend social club than a serious fighting force. So, when World War II officially began in 1939, Australia did what it had always done. It answered the call to help the mother country. The nation raised a special expeditionary force, the Second Australian Imperial Force, and sent its best, most well-trained soldiers to the other side of the planet to help Great Britain fight Germany in Europe and North Africa. For 2 long years, Australia's finest were fighting and earning a fearsome reputation thousands of miles from home, leaving their own country almost completely defenseless. And then the unthinkable happened. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, and in the weeks that followed, they unleashed a blitzkrieg across Southeast Asia. Hong Kong, Malaya, the Philippines all fell with shocking speed. But for Australia, the one last hope was the supposedly impenetrable fortress of Singapore. This was the linchpin of Australia's entire defensive strategy. Thousands of Australian soldiers, part of the 8th Division, were stationed there, confident in the fortress's power. The fall of Singapore was considered an impossibility. But on February 15, 1942, the impossible happened. The fortress fell. In what Winston Churchill called the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history, Singapore was surrendered to the Japanese. Over 15,000 Australian soldiers were captured, condemned to years of brutal captivity from which many would never return. The defensive shield that Australia had relied on for generations was gone. The psychological shock was immense. Prime Minister John Curtin declared that the fall of Singapore opens the battle for Australia. And he was right. Just 4 days later, that battle began. The same Japanese naval force that had devastated Pearl Harbor appeared off the coast of northern Australia. 188 aircraft descended on the port city of Darwin, unleashing a torrent of bombs. When the day was over, ships were sunk in the harbor, buildings were flattened, and hundreds of civilians and service members were killed. For the first time, mainland Australia was under direct attack. The invasion everyone had feared was no longer a distant possibility. It felt terrifyingly imminent. Australia was staring into the abyss. The government was faced with 2 choices: submit to the invaders or fight for their very survival. They chose to fight. And what happened next was one of the most comprehensive national mobilizations the world has ever seen. The entire country was put on a war footing. Out of a total population of just 7 million people, Nearly 1 million would serve in the armed forces by the war's end. The army itself exploded, growing to 11 infantry divisions and 3 armored divisions. To put that in perspective, it was as if 1 out of every 10 people you knew suddenly put on a uniform and went to war. But an army is useless without weapons. With Great Britain fighting for its own life and America reeling from Pearl Harbor, Australia was on its own. If they needed an arsenal, they would have to build them themselves. And so they did. The nation's economy was transformed. Car factories were retooled to produce aircraft. Small workshops began churning out machine guns. They started building their own artillery pieces and even fighter bombers like the CAC Werraway from scratch. This period of incredible innovation produced one of the best weapons of the entire war, the Owen gun, designed by a young inventor named Evelyn Owen in his garage. The Army initially rejected his design, but after a series of brutal tests where it was submerged in mud and sand, the Owen gun proved to be almost impossible to jam, far outperforming the British Sten and American Thompson submachine guns. It was so effective in the wet, muddy conditions of jungle warfare that American soldiers would often trade their own weapons to get their hands on one. Australia wasn't just building an army, it was building an entire war industry from almost nothing. Even as this incredible mobilization was happening back home, Australian soldiers overseas were already forging a legend. In North Africa, they were tasked with defending the vital deepwater port of Tobruk in Libya. Its capture was a primary objective for Germany's most famous general, Ernie Rommel, the Desert Fox. In April 1941, Rommel's Afrika Korps laid siege to the port. For 242 grueling days, a garrison of around 14,000 Australians, along with British, Indian, and later Polish and Czechoslovakian troops, held out against constant ground and air attacks. The conditions were appalling: stifling heat, plagues of flies, dwindling supplies, and relentless bombardment. The Nazi propaganda machines seeking to demoralize the defenders began to mock them. A radio broadcaster nicknamed Lord Haw Haw taunted the soldiers, saying they were caught like rats in a trap, living in their underground holes and caves. But instead of being an insult, the soldiers embraced the name. They became, proudly, the Rats of Tobruk, a badge of honor symbolizing their resilience. They even struck their own makeshift medals in the shape of a rat. By holding Tobruk, they stopped Rommel's seemingly unstoppable army on its tracks, marking the first time German land forces had been decisively repelled in the North African campaign. The hard-won experience of these desert veterans would soon be desperately needed. As the Japanese threat grew, Australia's seasoned divisions were recalled from the Middle East to defend their homeland. This was no longer a distant war. It was a fight for their own country. The Japanese High Command planned to take Port Moresby, a key strategic base on the south coast of New Guinea. Its blockade would allow them to launch bombing raids against the Australian mainland. Blocked by sea at the Battle of Coral Sea, they opted for an overland assault. The only thing standing in their way was a single, treacherous path through the dense, mountainous jungle, the Kokoda Track. Defending this 96-kilometer trail was initially just a small group of young, undertrained Australian militia soldiers from the 39th Battalion. For 4 agonizing months, they fought one of the most brutal campaigns of the war. Outnumbered, they battled not only a determined enemy, but also the terrain itself: steep, muddy slopes, torrential rain, and rampant diseases like malaria and dysentery. They were pushed back and pushed back through desperate and bloody engagements until the Japanese were at Oribiwa Ridge, just miles from their objective. It was here, at the last defensible line, that the tide began to turn. Exhausted and with their own supply lines stretched to the breaking point, the Japanese faltered. The Australians, now reinforced with veteran troops, began to push back. Throughout this campaign, they were aided by the local Papuan natives, whom the Australians affectionately named the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels. These men carried supplies up to the front lines and most critically carried the sick and wounded back down the treacherous track, saving countless lives. But even while the brutal fight for the Kokoda track was underway, the Japanese made a fatal miscalculation, what some considered their biggest mistake of the war. Believing the area to be lightly defended, they launched a second seaborne invasion to seize a newly constructed Allied airbase at Milne Bay, at the eastern tip of New Guinea. Japanese intelligence suggested they would face only a few hundred militia soldiers. Instead, their 2,000 elite Marines ran headfirst into nearly 9,000 Allied troops, the majority of them experienced Australians, supported by RAAF Kitty Hawk fighter planes. The battle was fought for 13 days in disgusting rain-soaked swamps,